Afternoon to most of you and morning to a few of you. Welcome to this press conference on protecting voting rights, stopping the filibuster, protecting our democracy, and ensuring a living minimum wage. We've come today as the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, with this leading group of Christian pastors from across the nation, literally representing hundreds of thousands of people, to release a statement, a pastoral letter to the nation. Some of the pastors here will speak, but all will be available for questions and follow-up. It's now my privilege to introduce a pastor, president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, Rev Dr William J. Barber II.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. And let me thank you for organizing and pulling together this tremendous body of clergy, men representing thousands and thousands of people across this country in the Christian faith, Black and white and Latino, people who recognize gay and straight, who have decided that we must speak out in this moment in the public square and raise some of these issues that are being debated from the puny echoes of left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, conservative versus liberal, to the area of what are our deepest moral values. And so that is why we must and we had to speak out and will continue to challenge the use of the filibuster in the United States Senate. For me as a Christian pastor for nearly 30 years, over 30 years, I cannot get away from this passage of scripture. Woe unto you, teachers of the law, Pharisees and hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spice and mint and your cumin and dill, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. That is a text from Jesus, Matthew 23, where he is literally criticizing the religious and political leaders of his day that paid so much attention to little small rules, but in doing so, they actually left undone the most important issues of their day and society. Here it is succinctly. The filibuster is a centerpiece of the arcane obstructionist rules of the United States Senate. It bars that body from the deliberative role it is supposed to have. The filibuster has been used to block anti-slavery legislation, women's suffrage, anti-lynching legislation, civil rights legislations, voting rights legislation, raising the minimum wage legislation, women's rights, and consumer protection. Just to name a few things, it has been used historically to block. It has been used to stall or shelve presidential appointments, federal judicial nomination, laws addressing unemployment benefits in times of national economic emergency. It has been used to block environmental protection measures in a global climate crisis. It has been used to block laws requiring the disclosure of political contributions in a country appalled by the flood of dark money, where a majority of so-called conservatives favor that dark money. The filibuster rule discourages public debate. It impedes the public's capacity to find out whether or not their elected representatives are blocking legislation that would serve them and lift them up. The filibuster creates an impoverished democracy. And let me say this clearly and pass on to the other clergy. By supporting the filibuster, you are either an advocate or an enabler of systemic racism, voter suppression, greed, the denial of health care, and the denial of living wages. You can't have it both ways. To support the filibuster, morally, you are either an advocate or an enabler of all of those things. And we have been working with this political sin far too long. The filibuster leaves undone the justice that is so needed in this nation. It is time to end it and have full and free debate and up or down votes in the United States Senate. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. We will now list who is here in the presence in this press conference. As was mentioned, we have powerful people here in support of what it means to lift up these voices and to lift it up against the filibuster because it leaves too many things undone. I'm Reverend Cassimir Brown, serving as one of the directors of the National Faith Team, and also introduce Dr. Adam Barnes. We will now read who is here in support. Reverend Dr. Cynthia L. Hale, Senior Pastor of Ray of Hope Christian Church in Decatur, Georgia. Reverend Dr. Ralph West, Senior Pastor of Church Without Walls, Houston, Texas. Reverend Dr. Amos Brown, Senior Pastor of Third Baptist Church, San Francisco, California. Reverend Dr. Reginald Buckley, Senior Pastor of Cade Chapel Baptist Church, Jackson, Mississippi. Reverend Dr. Leslie Callahan, Senior Pastor of St. Paul Baptist Church, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Reverend Ginger Gaines Sorelli, Senior Pastor of Foundry United Methodist Church, Washington, D.C. Reverend Cheryl Cornish, Senior Pastor of First Congregational Church, Memphis, Tennessee. Reverend Dr. Elaine Flake, Co-Pastor of Greater Allen AME Church, Jamaica, New York. Bishop Yvette Thunder, Senior Pastor of City of Refuge, United Church of Christ in Oakland, California. Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III, Senior Pastor of Friendship West Baptist Church, Dallas, Texas. And I'll pass it to Dr. Adam Barnes.
Thank you, Reverend Cassimir. Take over from here. We have also Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, the Senior Pastor of Middle Collegiate Church in New York, New York. Bishop Sir Walter Mack, Senior Pastor of Union Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, Senior Pastor of Trinity Church of Christ in Chicago, Illinois. Reverend Dr. Nancy Petty, the Senior Pastor at Poland Baptist in Raleigh, North Carolina. Reverend Janae Pitts Murdoch, the Senior Pastor of Light of the World in Indianapolis, Indiana. Reverend Dr. C.J. Rhodes, the pastor at Mount Helm Baptist Church in Jackson, Mississippi. Reverend Dr. Stacy Spencer, Senior Pastor of New Direction Christian Church, also in Memphis, Tennessee. And Reverend Dr. Gina Stewart, Senior Pastor of the Christ Baptist Church in, in Memphis, Tennessee. Reverend Dr. Jacqueline A. Thompson, the Senior Pastor of Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, California. Reverend Dr. J. Lawrence Turner, the Senior Pastor of the Boulevard Christian Church in Memphis, Tennessee. And lastly, Reverend Dr. Olivia Bryan Upy Grove, the Minister of Ministries Across Generations for the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and also the Pastor of Independence Christian Church in Independence, Kentucky. I'll pass it back to you, Reverend Cassimir, to introduce our first speaker.
Dr. Brown, Reverend Brown, Cassimir, let me mention one thing just as these pastors come on so the media is very clear. We come and we're speaking because there are 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country whose issues are not spoken to because of the filibuster. There are 87 million people who are uninsured or underinsured, whose issues are not spoken to because of the filibuster. There are 62 million people who make less than a living wage, whose issues are not spoken to because of the filibuster. There are 4 million people that get up every morning and can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water, whose issues are not spoken to because of the filibuster. There are 65 million, over a third of the electorate is poor and low wealth now, over 65 million people whose issues are not spoken to and addressed because of the filibuster. 43% of this nation and growing are poor and low wealth, and their issues are often not spoken to because of the filibuster. And now millions of people's rights, Black people, brown people, Asian people, Native people, poor people, voting rights are being threatened every day. And we have the power in the Congress, the Senate, to stop these things and to change these realities. But the filibuster is a hindrance to even discussing the issues, let alone addressing them. That's why this powerful group of clergy that you just heard name are here today to speak. Reverend Cassimir.
Thank you. And the next voice that you'll hear is that of Reverend Dr. Cynthia L. Hale, Senior Pastor of Ray of Hope Christian Church of Decatur, Georgia.
Thank you, Reverend Brown. Good afternoon. It is my privilege to join the Poor People's Campaign and these distinguished pastors who love God and love God's people to call on Congress, the Senate, and the Biden administration to immediately end the filibuster and enact legislation that would ensure justice and equality for all. History is replete with examples of how this simple procedural mechanism has been used as a tool against rather than for democracy. It has blocked legislation that would benefit the people that we all serve, such as voting rights, economic justice, healthcare, and common sense gun laws. People are literally living on the edge in the states that our elected officials represent, wondering how they're going to make it from day to day, how they will feed themselves and their children, how they will survive if they get sick, since they don't have health care. Right now, we need protection from voter suppression as Georgia, my home state, leads the way in restricting access to voting that will affect African Americans and other people of color in adverse ways, and criminalize providing water and snacks to those who are standing in line to vote. Right now, people need a living minimum wage of $15 an hour to come out of poverty and live a quality life. We need our elected officials to act now. As people of faith, we believe that every person is created in the image and likeness of God and has inestimable worth and value, and thus needs to be treated as such. As churches, we work to impact and transform this present world into the kingdom of God. In the kingdom of God, there is no poverty, no violence, no hunger, no suppression of voting rights or any other rights. It is our vision that our nation and world would begin even now to become what God designed and created it to be, His kingdom here on earth. God needs all of us to make it so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Hale. The next voice you'll hear is that of Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III, Senior Pastor of Friendship West Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas.
Thank you so much, Reverend Brown. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Bishop Barber, Reverend Theo Harris, Reverend Alvin O'Neill Jackson, for calling together this coalition of conscience, this team of prophetic witnesses to stand against that which precludes possibility in this nation. I believe it's the Message translation by Eugene Peterson that remixes, I believe it's Isaiah chapter 10, verse 1, and says, "Doomed to you who legislate evil, who make laws that make victims." We're in a struggle for the soul of our democracy. And sadly, our possibility toward becoming a more perfect union are being paralyzed by an antiquated relic of a racist past that is diabolically designed to negate the voices of those whom Sly Stone referred to as everyday people. The filibuster and voter suppression bills across the country have been united in unholy wedlock, and yet having the nerve to be dressed up in a tuxedo of political respectability. But y'all, we've seen this movie before. This is Jim and Jane Crow apartheid, again in a tuxedo. It's morally reprehensible, it's democratically unsustainable, and we have a clear choice in this battle. Will we have a government by the few, for the few, or a government that is for the people and by the people? Understand who we are. We are the children of civil rights warriors who marched to make America better. They put their lives on the line, and they paid for our right to vote and our voice with their blood, their sweat, their tears, and their marching feet. They put their lives on the line to breathe new life into America. We're the children of freedom fighters who refuse to back down. So guess what? We've seen this movie before. And because we've seen this movie before, we know how it ends. We shall overcome. We've seen this movie before, and we're going to be all right. We've seen this movie before, and we warn America by remixing the words of Jesus in the judgment when he spoke to the nations. And I hear Jesus saying to America, I was hungry, and you filibustered. When it came to food stamp programs, I was thirsty, and you filibustered. When it came to ensuring I had unleaded water, I was a stranger, and you filibustered. When it came to ensuring that we had liberty and justice, even for those at our southern borders. America's gonna say, when did you do it? And Jesus was saying, as much as you did it to the least of these, you've done it also unto me. In the name of the God of justice, end the filibuster now.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Haynes. The next voice you will hear is that of Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, Director of the Cairo Center and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
Good morning, good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be and an honor to be in the company of these powerful pastors and moral leaders of our day. I'm here because I joined my voice with others in this pastoral letter and at this press conference, calling out the immorality of attempts to deny so many human beings living wages and healthcare, adequate food, housing, water, education, calling out the immorality of denying so many of their voice, of their vote, in violation of what Jesus in the Holy Bible called the weightier matters of the law, matters of justice, matters of mercy, matters of defending the cause of the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable. As a white Christian, as a pastor and a biblical scholar, I'm motivated to speak out against using the filibuster in this country to filibuster democracy, to filibuster the expansion and protection of voting rights, to filibuster living wages and healthcare and housing and adequate guaranteed incomes and debt cancellation and water and sanitation and housing rights and so much more. Our sacred texts are clear that those in positions of power are called to set forth laws that protect the poor, that impose fair taxation systems, that call for canceling debts, for paying living wages, that protect the voices and the demands of all people, not just an elite select few who are rich and white and powerful. And our sacred texts call for those in power to set forth laws and legislation that lifts from the bottom, starting first at the bottom, so that all in our society may rise. We must end the filibuster. We must do this to save the soul of our democracy. We must do this to stand against racism and poverty and ecological devastation and militarism and this distorted, this false moral narrative of Christian nationalism. And we must do it now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Theo Harris. The next voice you'll hear is that of Reverend Dr. Reginald Buckley, Senior Pastor of Cade Chapel Baptist Church in Jackson, Mississippi.
Good morning, and thank you for the privilege to be able to share just a few thoughts with you on this day concerning this topic. When that which was created with noble intentions is used intentionally for dubious purposes, there is a moral obligation to call it out, correct it, and if necessary, dismantle it. Jesus does exactly this when he enters the temple saying, "My Father's house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." The filibuster very well began with noble intent, but it has been made into something that robs, kills, and destroys the potential for human flourishing in this country. Rather than a tool to break through partisan wranglings, lawmakers have turned it into a weapon that is wielded to threaten, to bully, and to obstruct the kind of transformational legislation that would work to make of this nation a more perfect union. When anti-lynching legislation came before the Congress, it was filibustered, giving what James Weldon Johnson called, quote, "a license for mobs to lynch unmolested," end of quote. When civil rights legislation came before Congress, it was filibustered, keeping the entrenchment of white supremacy solidly in place. When voting rights legislation for Blacks came before Congress, it was filibustered, keeping Black voices silenced and unable to participate in the franchise. At every significant moment in history, when advances were being made to create a more perfect union, the filibuster kept that stated goal from being completely realized. And while they filibustered, Black bodies were lynched throughout the American South. While they filibustered, rights were withheld, futures were denied, and disparities grew wider. While they filibustered, freedom and justice remained the reality of but a privileged few. Therefore, we come today in the tradition of Jesus, who turned over the tables in the temple because he was incensed over what the temple had become. In that same tradition, we come to you incensed that by using the filibuster, you have made the house built to serve the people of this country into a den of thieves, where progress is robbed, potential is plundered, opportunity is pillaged. Jesus turned over tables because they took something good and used it for something evil. We come to call out the evil misuse of the filibuster and to insist upon its removal from Senate rules so that the fullness of this country's potential can finally see the light of day.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Buckley. The next voice you will hear is that of Reverend Dr. Olivia Bryan Upy Grove, Minister of Ministries Across Generations for the Christian Church of Disciples of Christ.
Thank you. Thank you all for bringing us together today to speak to our country's leaders. A filibuster diminishes the importance of what it requires to be a just and loving community where all voices seek to have great value. So my role as a faith leader and as a mother is often to help specifically children and families understand how to live faithfully within their community and with all of creation. I tell my children that living faithfully is not always easy, because it's not easy to share, to take turns, and to work together. Justice and love in community with one another takes practice, and adults and leaders are the ones who need to be the examples of how to engage and not obstruct, like the filibuster does, these important practices. So we as Americans should expect our adult leaders to not shortchange the processes of democratic engagement. I hope that when done well, our country can profoundly live more faithfully, justly, lovingly, and freely. But a filibuster is a non-constitutional practice that allows a small group of people to behave like bullies. It permits them to change the dynamic of the entire playground. And bullies do not have the skills needed to engage in the difficult conversations and interactions that allow all people to be represented. Bullies create instead distrust and shortchange quality growth. So we should all want a country with leaders that can be examples to all our children, that love is what wins when we respect each other's voices and do the hard work of adulting. When we don't do the hard work of being Americans together. When we let things like the filibuster remain. We see the fear and the distrust that that creates. Our children see it too.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Upy Grove. The next voice you will hear is that of Reverend Dr. J. Lawrence Turner, Senior Pastor of the Boulevard Christian Church of Memphis, Tennessee.
Thank you, Reverend Brown, and to all of you who gather on this day. It was in 2010, while testifying before the U.S. Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, Brookings Institute Senior Fellow Sarah Binder is noted to have said, "When we dig into the history of Congress, it seems that the filibuster was created by mistake." Her assertion comes from Senate proceedings in 1805, which were presided over by Vice President Aaron Burr. Burr, who in the context of a larger conversation concerning having a cleaner Senate rule book, uses the previous question motion as an example of a duplicate rule. Without any thought, by 1806, it was dropped from the rule book. This, in effect, took away the ability of a simple majority of the body to cut off debate and empowered the filibuster. What Binder suggests happened by mistake has been used deliberately and with great intention to hijack our democracy and to nullify the will of the American people. This is not only unfair and unjust, it is immoral. This is why, as a faith leader, I am compelled to speak up and speak out, calling for the filibuster to be eliminated. The times that we live call for moral courage from those who represent us in the U.S. Senate. Not only is the soul of our democracy in peril, but the fundamental ideals on which our country was founded, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are still unrealized. Now more than ever, we need the legislative branch to pass policy that can restore and redeem the soul of our nation. It's time to clear the way for the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. It's time to clear the way for the passage of H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It's time to clear the way for the passage of a $15 an hour minimum wage. And as I am joining this press conference virtually from the state of Tennessee, a state that in recent weeks has passed permitless gun carry that has been signed by the governor, we need comprehensive gun reform if we're ever to stop the scourge of mass shootings and urban gun violence. I join with my colleagues from across this nation in calling for an end to the filibuster so that we live into a more perfect vision of this nation, living into a day when justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Turner. We'll now hear from Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II.
Thank you so much. And to all our brothers and sisters who have spoken so powerfully, I want to thank Dr. Lawrence too for reminding us of the ignoble beginnings of the filibuster, and also reminding us that this filibuster doesn't just block rules, it waters down legislation. That's the other disturbing tool. Is used in a way to hold out until the original intention of a piece of legislation is so watered down, is so distorted that it has a name that it says something, but it actually doesn't do it. You know, if we're not careful, even say with the George Floyd police reform, a filibuster will be used to water it down when we actually need to be adding to that bill. For instance, there should be federal charges for murder when police engaged in the killing of innocent people, to guarantee that if they get off at the local level, they don't get off at the federal level. $15 should be immediate, but a filibuster will be used to make it 5 years from now. By that time, it's obsolete. Health care should be for everybody, universal, but a filibuster will be used to water it down so it doesn't reach all of the people. And that's what was done with every piece of civil rights legislation. The filibuster always won. Even if the bill eventually got passed, the filibuster always distorted it from its original purposes. Before we take questions, I do have two people I want to ask if they have anything to say. They may not, but because Bishop Yvette Flunder and Reverend Dr. Nancy Petty, because we know for years the filibuster was used in ugly ways to distort and to stop actions, particularly to people based on their sexual orientation. And we have to understand, in this move, the same people that are against voting rights are also against living wages, are also against public education, are also against all people being treated fair regardless of their race, their color, their sexual orientation. That they are cynical enough to be together. And we have to be smart enough and powerful enough to come together. So I just want to ask them, they may not, but if they have anything they want to say on this matter, and then we'll go to questions from the media.
Thank you for the opportunity, Bishop Barber. I will just say this. I am amazed at the ways in which religion and faith and God, by all of God's names and all of God's manifestations, has been weaponized against the rights of people. And all of the folks who have been brought up in our conversation today are experiencing the ways in which faith, which ought to be the panacea for peace, for our being able to be together and work seamlessly in the work of peace and justice, faith is being used as a weapon against justice. And it's incredibly important that we as people of faith stand together and bring into this atmosphere the kind of presence of the divine that will create not only incredible and powerful opportunities for justice, but will push back against things like the unjust and wicked filibuster. God bless you.
Thank you.
I think it goes without saying that as a gay person living in America, I'm not free until all my brothers and sisters who experience discrimination and oppression are free. And the prophet Micah was real clear. What does God require of us but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly? Eliminating the filibuster is a justice issue. It is a compassionate kindness issue, and we must end it now.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. All are so profound and so prophetic. The nation has to hear from you. That's why we're coming together. And America, you're right, Dr. Haynes is going to be asked that question. When I was, did you filibuster? Did you filibuster? Members of the media, if you have questions for any of the clergy that are here on the line, we ask you to raise them now. I think Yolanda is going to be handling that, if I'm not mistaken.
No,
and so
I think Kaz has it.
Kaz, I'm sorry. Kaz, you can bring the media in now.
Yes, thank you. We have two questions from Jack Jenkins from the Religion News Service. The first question reads as follows. Can you say more about how you as faith leaders see eliminating the filibuster as connected to the broader pushback to various election bills in Georgia, Texas, and elsewhere?
If the filibuster was eliminated and we could have an up and down vote, and first of all, we think it is terrible that Joe Manchin, who both claims to be a person of faith and comes from a state that's also engaging in voter suppression, and a state that has over 352,000 people making less than $15 an hour, he should be leading the effort to stop the filibuster rather than saying he's gonna hold on to it irregardless. Most of these bills that are being passed, some of them are saying it's because of the lie that Trump told. That's part of the truth. The other part of the truth is all of these states know that the HR 1 bill, which would expand voting rights, which would bring more consistency into the voting process across the country, would bring early voting and same-day registration and many of the things that are happening in some states, it would be federalized across the country and made a part of the rules in all states. They know that that bill, if it gets passed, then it would undermine the ability of states to take those things away from citizens. Secondly, they know that the John Lewis bill, the restoration of an expansion of the Voting Rights Act, that if the Voting Rights Act was reinstated, Section 5 that was gutted on June 25th, 2013, over almost 2,900 days ago, over 7 years ago, when the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court said, we throw this now to the Congress. And for more than 7 years, McConnell and Republicans have filibustered. They have not fixed the Voting Rights Act. Why? Because if the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was passed, then every bill we see now, especially in southern states from Georgia to Texas and North Carolina, would have to go through something called pre-clearance. And they wouldn't make it. They couldn't make it through pre-clearance. So what you see, yes, is a response of these legislators to the great lie of Trump, but they're trying to get all of this done before these bills are passed in the Congress. They're trying to get it done before the mid-year elections when there might be more than a 50-50 split in the Senate. It may be 52-48, Democrats 52 and Republicans 48, and then these things can be passed. So they're trying to hurry up and get these bills passed before this federal legislation comes into place. And that's what's so ugly about this. They know that there are efforts now in the Congress to expand voting rights. There are efforts in the Congress to restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. They know that. And so there's an attempt to hurry up and pass all of this suppressive voting suppression laws before those bills get passed. Secondly, you should also know that the Chamber of Commerce, now why, let's ask this, why is the Chamber of Commerce coming out against HR 1? The Chamber of Commerce, just the other day, decided they're against the voting rights bill. It's because of what Dr. King told us, the threat of Black and brown and white people voting together in a way that can fundamentally shift political power and therefore shift economic power has always been the fear of what he called the ruling class and the aristocracy. And so the powers, the economic powers of this country, the ruling class, do not want all of the people to vote, because they know that the majority of the people will vote for health care. They will vote for living wages. They will vote for more money for public education. And so what you have is a unholy relationship between the Supreme Court justices who back Citizens United, Congress people who are the corporate pawns of corporations in the Congress, and those who have always supported systemic racism when it comes to vote suppression. And that's an unholy trinity, if you will, that is trying to do everything they can before any federal legislation is passed that would expand voting rights and bring back into existence Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which is pre-clearance. Don't ever forget that word, pre-clearance. That causes great fear in state legislatures, that they can pass a law, but before that law is actualized, it has to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department. That is the great fear right now. And that's why we are saying the filibuster must be ended and we must have up and down votes on these matters.
Thank you. The second part of Jack Jenkins' question is, how does this group connect the push for voting rights to the movement for DC statehood, which is hosting a faith-based event tomorrow, which is likely also going to be talking about eliminating the filibuster?
Well, in the Poor People's Campaign, we affirm DC statehood. Let's just say it is wrong for the thousands of people in DC not to have any representation, but to have taxation. That's clear and simple. They have taxation without representation. They don't have senators. They don't have members of the United States Congress, but they are taxed. They are taxed. And so it is wrong. And that also has deep roots in what systemic racism is all about, which is why one of the things our movement says, when we talk about systemic racism, yes, we have to talk about police reform and police brutality, but that's a piece of systemic racism. That's not the total. Systemic racism is blocking living wages, because if you had living wages, you would lift 40% of Black people out of poverty and low wealth immediately. Systemic racism is voter suppression, trying to keep people from exercising their right to vote, denying or bridging the right to vote. Systemic racism is blocking the chocolate city. That's what it's called. DC was called the chocolate city. Blocking the chocolate city from having representation, but at the same time, you tax them the same way you do other people throughout this country. And there's a long history, we don't have time to go into it, but we believe that DC should have full statehood and that all of the citizens there should have the same kind of representation that all of us enjoy or want to enjoy in our various states.
Thank you. The next question is from Maya Jaradet, excuse me if I mispronunciation, from Desert News. My questions are, what will or should a national campaign against voter suppression laws look like? Strikes, boycotts, marches? I'm looking for a brass tacks of what actions we might see in the coming months. And what can ordinary citizens do to fight the attempt to roll back voting rights?
Well, one of the things they should do today is join this effort to call for the end of the filibuster. I would say all of the above. I would say that some things we should have done long before now. Many organizations should have been pushing to restore the Voting Rights Act long before now. As I said, it's been over 7 years since June 25th, 2013. But we must utilize our voice in every way, push our congresspersons. I can tell you that last year we had planned to have a mass Poor People's Assembly March on Washington, June 20th of last year in person. We didn't because of COVID, but 2.4 million people showed up online. We are now planning for a virtual march and then an in-person march in 2022, where poor people of every race, creed, and color and sexual orientation come together to challenge 5 interlocking injustices: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative, religious nationalism. We have to put pressure on all of our congresspeople, all of our senators. We have to continue to register to vote. The mid-year elections are coming up, and we know that if that for instance, among poor people, 35 million poor people voted this past election, but that meant 30 million didn't vote in this past election. Even though 55% of all poor and low-wealth people voted for Biden and Harris in this past election. So just because there is an attempt to suppress our votes, we can never suppress the votes by staying home. We must engage and continue to elect people that are serious about voting rights for everyone. But when you ask that question, there can be nothing left off the table. Right now, you have in the States, you have people calling for corporations. In the Poor People's Campaign, what we have said is there's 2 different ways you can do boycotts. One is to challenge the corporations and then they move to another state. Well, they still make money if they move to the other state. But the other way is to look down the list of those corporate executives and find out which ones are supporting the senators that are supporting voter suppression. We need to be very strategic in this, because a corporation can actually give a public statement against the law in Georgia. They can move their gains from Georgia. And a lot of times that's going to hurt many poor and low wealth people. And then the corporate executives can still be giving money to McConnell, still be giving money. What we need to do is to challenge those corporate leaders and say, if you are serious about stopping voter suppression, then stop giving money and enabling the senators who in fact are promoting and encouraging and legislating voter suppression. Let me ask some of the other people on the line if they want to take a shot at this question of the kinds of things that you're prepared to do as faith leaders and believe we have to do in this moment. Cass, you may call on any other leaders on the line.
We also have a question for Bishop Mack.
Let me see if any other leaders want to speak to that question about what we should be doing in this moment. Okay.
Well, as faith leaders, we need to be addressing these issues in the pulpit. If we are pastors of churches and we have the responsibility of being God's voice in the world, we have to take these issues into the pulpit and speak clearly and passionately about them to our people and help educate our people. And then we have to organize where we are to be a voice with our legislators in our communities to speak out on these issues and to be prepared to go the distance with that, whatever that might mean. But we as faith leaders stand in a place of privilege and responsibility, and we have to take these issues into our worship services, into our pulpits, and make clear statements about the injustice of them all.
Cass, let's just take one more question after Dr. Cynthia Hale speaks, and then we're going to close out the press conference, and persons can call individuals if they need to. And we want the press to make sure to read the letter, because that pastoral letter is very clear about some of the things we're prepared to do. Dr. Hale.
Thank you, Bishop. Just wanted to share that in Georgia, we have a contingency of clergy led by Dr. Reginald Bishop, Reginald Jackson, who is the bishop, AME bishop for our district, our state, meeting with CEOs today. I'm with you all, but they are meeting as we speak to try to dialogue and figure out how we can get the CEOs to make stronger statements. Of course, they're dialoguing about that. They're talking about that. But I just wanted you all to know that clergy are meeting with the CEOs of the companies.
That's right. And let me say to the media, one thing you should know. Even with the undemocratic attempts to suppress the vote, the Poor People's Campaign did a study last year with a professor from Columbia University called Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low Wealth Voters. And this is what we found. In 15 states, including states like Georgia, Texas, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, if 1 to 22% of poor and low wealth people that have not voted register and vote, 1% in Michigan, 4% in Florida, 19% in North Carolina. If we organize 1 to 22% of poor and low wealth people around an agenda and they vote, they could decide, not 30%, not 40%, 1 to 22% could decide who sits in the Congress, who sits in the Senate, and who sits in the presidency. So we will continue to mobilize this fusion coalition of people of all races and colors and creeds, because even though their attempt to suppress the vote, we will fight every attempt to suppress it. We will go into court and fight every attempt to suppress the vote. But even while you're trying to suppress it, we will rise, we will push up, we will continue to mobilize, because we have no other choice. The very soul of this democracy is on the line. And the problems that face this country are public policy problems. You want more wealth, you got to have public policy that lends itself to wealth building. You want healthcare, you got to have public policy that lends itself to healthcare, which is why we open our letter with that scripture from Isaiah 10. Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. We are drawing a line in the sand, saying we can't be silent anymore. We can't allow people to continue to rob the poor of their rights legislatively and through public policy.
I know that there's a long list of questions, but just before the last question we received today, I want to just acknowledge Dr. Ralph West, senior pastor of Church Without Walls in Houston, Texas, who joined us since we started the conference, and we're happy that he's here with us today.
What are some? Could you call out who's asking the questions, Kaz? Do you see a list of what news media groups there are?
Yes, the two questions we have left is from Stephen Rosenfield from The Independent and Paul Garber from 88.5 WFDD. Paul Garber is having a question in regards to North Carolina, and Stephen Rosenfield has a question in regards to Texas.
Okay, let's take the one for Texas. We'd say we do one more question, and then for Garber, he can call Dr. Mack directly if he would. So if that's the question, then one more. Is that all we have out there?
Yes.
Great. Okay, Dr. Haynes, can you take the Texas question? Yeah. All right.
The question from Stephen Rosenfield is, what is the correct response when opponents of representative government hijacks the language of equality and justice to defend exclusionary bills, i.e. in Texas, saying that the same election rules must be applied in tiny rural counties as in Harris County, or Texas, where millions live? Houston, excuse me, where millions live.
Right. Well, again, I think what the Poor People's Campaign has done is a model for all of us, and that the Poor People's Campaign retook the word moral from the immorality of the moral majority and recaptured the language and then calibrated in such a fashion that they connected it to that which is truly moral, truly biblical, and truly reflective of faith traditions. And so it's very important in this specific instance, for example, that we call out exactly what's going on, not just the immorality of it, but the sad fact that, again, this is Jim and Jane Crow apartheid dressed up in a tuxedo. And so we call it out for what it is. And at the same time as calling it out for what it is, we then declare what morality looks like. Morality looks like ensuring that we don't legislate so that persons are poor, so that we don't, and I love the passage that Bishop Barber quoted earlier from Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, which applies directly to the piece that you're talking about, because again, they are tithing that which is minutia, but they are avoiding justice. And so we recognize that morality and justice are united in holy wedlock, and anything that is unjust is also immoral.
Thank you all so much, everybody, for coming on. Thank you, Reverend Cash, Reverend Williams, Dr. Barnes, Dr. Jackson, for pulling us together in these powerful ways. Members of the media, you can reach all of these clergy individually. We all have signed on to this letter. We all are speaking with one voice. We all are standing together, and we all understand that this is a moment in history. In fact, every moment is a moment in history where we must stand as moral and prophetic leaders. And also, this is pastoral work, because for the nation to ignore fixing the things that can be fixed, if we don't speak out against them and challenge them, is a form of pastoral malpractice. And we will not be malpracticing pastors. We will stand with Jesus. We will stand with the prophets. We will continue to call this nation to be what it ought to be, whether it hears it or not. But we believe in the power that the word goes out, it will not come back void. And so thank all of you. God bless you. And we'll continue to work together. As we say, forward together, not one step back. Take care now.